They say that there's no real need to put a coat of varnish on an acrylic painting. They're good to go, as they are. But what I love acrylic paints because they all dry at a fairly even finish. But with oil paints, I found that some parts were quite dull and other parts were quite shiny. So you had this gloss and this matte effect. And I used to really enjoy the varnishing stage when I was painting in oils, because what it did was it evened it all out. The main reason I'm varnishing my acrylic painting this time is because I feel it gives it a lovely protective coating. What I tend to do is put on about 2 coats of the varnish, very, very thin layers, and I do it so that it is flat on the table. Today I'm using a solvent-based varnish. You can have water-based varnishes, you can have varnishes with matte finishes, semi-gloss, gloss finishes. I'm using it's called a universal satin matte, so it's quite flat. What I do is I decanter an amount into a container, and I use again a synthetic brush. But notice this time that this is a designated brush purely for this purpose. I've actually written solvent varnish on this brush, and so that I don't use this for acrylic painting at all. It's a special brush specifically for this job. So what I do is I dip my lovely soft brush into the varnish, and I try and get this on in a lovely, nice, even, smooth finish. I don't want to apply it very fast. If I apply it fast, I tend to get bubbles in it, and I want it to be a lovely thin coat. So I just start off and I use both sides of the brushes, and I go outside the area of the painting. So I actually am varnishing outside the painted area. And I go across the painting. I use both sides of the brushes, and I just try and coat every single speck of the canvas and the painting at this stage. I lay it on and then I spread it out. And now it's the same process all the way through, and I make sure that it's a lovely even coat. It's said that you do not have to varnish an acrylic painting, as the paint is really strong and flexible on its own. But I like the idea of that extra protection to my work. The dried acrylic painting attracts and gathers dirt more easily than an oil painting, due to the electrostatic properties and the surface film, which is always quite soft. Notice that I'm painting it flat. It's lying flat. I want the varnish to settle in. I don't want it to run down the page. I want it to be lovely and even on the surface. So I'm painting the varnish on a flat surface, and my painting is still held to the board via the staples. And the reason I do that is because even though the varnish is it's wet, so basically what will happen is the canvas will actually stretch. So what I want to do is make sure that it's taped down so the canvas is nice and it dries nice and flat. Once I get to this stage, I put the varnish down, and then I just even it all the way out, and I can do it in a horizontal and vertical stroke, so it's lovely and even and smooth. And I make sure I get all the lumps and drips out, and I also make sure that there's no bubbles in it at all, and I make sure that the edges are all exactly the same. Now what I'll do is I'll give this 2 coats. I'll wait for this to dry completely. I usually wait overnight so that it's thoroughly dry before I put the next coat on. I do 2 coats, minimum of 2 coats, sometimes 3, depending on how big the painting is. And I sometimes use the spray can, and if I do that, the reason I use the spray right at the very end is to just make sure that the surface is all nice and dull. I like to have a flat varnish because when I always think that when a painting's done with the acrylics, it has that kind of shiny plastic feel to it, and by the time I've finished putting this varnish on, it'll even it all out and make it nice and flat. And it also has It makes it easier for when I photograph it, if the painting goes into print, and for my records. So the one I've chosen is a satin matte finish. I don't want it to be too glossy, and I don't want it to be too flat. It's that nice in the middle feel, and it gives the painting a lovely luster, and it brings out all the lovely, beautiful, fresh acrylic paints. The reason I use the solvent-based varnish at this stage is because, remember right at the very beginning I said I want to try and paint my acrylic paints so that they are oil-like? Well, essentially what I'm doing is I'm putting a solvent over the top of my acrylics, and I've essentially turned this, now an acrylic painting, into, for all intents and purposes, an oil painting. So that was one reason I use a solvent varnish. The other reason I use a solvent varnish is because I feel that the solvent varnishes are very strong, a lovely protective coating to my work. I want my work to be around for a long time, for people to appreciate my work for a long time in the future, and that's why I use the solvent varnish. I must remember to wash my brush out. I use a turpentine substitute. I don't like the smell of terps. It just gives me a headache. And the turpentine substitute it does exactly the same job, but it's very odor free, very friendly as far as I'm concerned. So once I clean my brush out, I'll lock that solvent up, and the varnishing process is done, completed. So now we're just removing the staples because I want to send it off to the framer. So now that it's completely dry, we've now had 2 coats of varnish put on this, and it's completely dry, and it now gets taken off this board, and I take it into the framer to be framed. Yeah, sometimes it's an advantage to have the canvas flat like not on a stretcher frame, because it means that if this was a commission piece, the client can actually take this canvas direct to the framer and they can pick their own frame out. It also means that if the client was overseas, they can actually pick this painting up, and we can put it into a roll. We can roll it up, put it into a postage tube, and send it to wherever it needs to go. It's now ready at this stage to be taken off to the framer, and he will then use the lovely border to wrap around a stretcher frame.